Hey, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. Welcome to our Wasteland Warfare series. This is episode 5. Today we're going to talk about terrain. For those of you that are getting into the game, this is a great opportunity for you, and it'll help me out. If you click the Amazon affiliate links in the description, they will take you to an Amazon link that will get you to a set of dice, which you will need for playing Wasteland Warfare. And there's also links for Super Mutants, if that's the faction you like, and also a link for Institute. So make sure you click those links in the description. It won't cost you any additional fee, and then it'll give me a kickback, so it'll help support the channel and allow you to get the things that you want in order to play the game. First of all, we're going to talk about types of terrain. We're going to talk about normal, difficult, impassable, climbable. I was going to add line of sight blocking, but then I remembered that I'm pretty sure I covered that inside the shooting video, the video that did actions with shooting and such, so I didn't cover it today. I know it says it is. I'm sorry. I'm a dirty liar. So first we're going to talk about normal terrain. Normal terrain imposes no restrictions, no bonuses, or penalties for moving across it. The core rulebook doesn't really have much of an example, but what I would consider normal terrain, I think of things like small crates and boxes and the like. Effectively anything that's like half of your model's height or smaller, unless it makes sense for it to be difficult or impassable. You know, things like loose sand that's really hard to traverse, patches of that, maybe some kind of mud, like things like that make sense. All in all, just kind of use common sense. Now, the book does say you should be having this discussion before every game, and while I agree, I also am all for having a system that already labels certain things so you don't have to have some of those discussions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. For difficult terrain, if a model's base would pass over any amount of difficult terrain during movement, that model reduces its movement by one color. And what I mean by that is if your movement's yellow and you move over difficult terrain, it goes down to orange. Doesn't matter how much of your base has to pass over it. If anything touches it, it goes down one color. Again, a few examples, but there are no real hard and fast rules, would include rocky terrain and unstable surfaces, items that can be leapt over, like barriers and desks. And then the other thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to show it to you in just a second here. The other thing to keep in mind, if you look at the screen, and if you're listening, that's fine too. Some models have the unimpeded icon, which is two mountains with a red line going through them. And this icon just means that their movement is unaffected by terrain. In order to keep consistent play with our local group, we've basically been working on our own terrain pack just so it's no matter who's playing who, the rules are consistent across the board. And that's basically that normal, which would be your 32 millimeter base models, like your Raiders and things like that. Those treat all terrain as difficult terrain. Basically, if it's not at the ground floor, it's just difficult terrain. Again, it's just one of those, this is the rule we've created. I know I just said if it's half, blah, 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 blah. But again, we needed something so that everybody was on the same page. All models treat all terrain as difficult terrain. Large models, which would be 40 mils and bigger, which would be power armor, treat all terrain that's half of an orange and larger as difficult. And then huge models, which would be 60 mils, that'd be like your behemoths and your sentry bots, treat orange and larger as difficult. And with the sentry bots specifically, what we try to imagine is it's not necessarily that it's going over it as much as it's just kind of going through it. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're having that like theater of mind experience and you're trying to figure out how this is supposed to work. Also try to remember it is still a game. Anything with impassable or any other rules would obviously supersede this, but this creates a simple system to make terrain and movement quick and easy without having to label every single piece of terrain on the table. We can simply go, hey, this is this tall, this is difficult for all these models, this is X tall, this is difficult for all of these models. Obviously, rules on cards would also supersede, such as the super mutants unimpeded. Such as the super mutant behemoth's unimpeded ability. Man, that was a struggle. And then we have impassable terrain. Impassable terrain is just impossible to move through unless something says it can. Unless something says it can. For this, it should generally make sense. Sheer cliffs, high walls, things that are just, you wouldn't have good handholds, footholds to climb it. And then interestingly, the example in the book states that deep water is impassable terrain, but it also says gutsies and handies could move over it. And though I haven't found anything to suggest in the rules that they could, there's no hoverability, there's no flyability, and I understand that these robots do float in the game. I'm not arguing that at all. I'm just surprised that there's nothing in the rules that actually supports this statement other than this example. Although, if I got to a table with somebody and they had a Mr. Handy, I'm not going to argue with them. I'm like, yeah, man, that can float. I understand it. It's just interesting to me that there's no rule that designates that yet. Maybe there is outside of the core book, but I haven't come across it as of right now. Then you also have climbable terrain. There are certain terrain features that are climbable, and this should be determined and discussed at the start of the game. This is one of the few things where I'm like, hey, man, like these are discussions you need to have, because if I go into a game thinking something's a climbable feature and then you don't have that in your head, that's going to create some scenarios where you're like, well, I didn't realize that, or I would have, or whatever. So it's one of those, like, understanding what's climbable is an important discussion. Obviously, there's certain features that are always going to be climbable, like if they have a ladder or a rope, etc. Climbing up and down a surface counts as difficult terrain. So again, if you move yellow and you want to climb, you only climb orange. I do assume that unimpeded would count for this also, although a lot of the models that have unimpeded also have the rule that says you can't climb, which we'll talk about in a little bit. What you do if you want to make a climb check is you make an agility test at the start of the climb, and we've already talked about how to make skill checks. You can check out that. There's a card going right now. If the climb check is successful, the model climbs up or down the surface, depending on what way you want to go. It moves its move distance, orange or yellow or whatever. Obviously, it's one color lower or smaller than what its actual movement is on the card. If the climb check is failed, the model falls, and then it's gonna take fall damage, right? Unless it's like not high enough to take fall damage, but you're gonna take fall damage, and you take it from the starting point of that climb action. So if you are climbing down and you're at a height of blue and you fail that, you count as having fallen from a height of blue. It doesn't matter, that you're climbing up or down, etc. It just matters where you started that climb action. If you also fail it, you're going to fall down. You'll go where you go, right? So if you're attempting to climb down a wall, you're going to fall to the bottom of that wall, and then your move action immediately ends. You don't get to continue your move. Whereas if you made that climb action, if you still had more movement in that action, you could actually make it. So just some things to keep in mind. And then when you're climbing, sometimes you may not have the movement to complete the entirety of a climb in a single action. When this is the case, if the model has another action, it can make that second action to climb. So again, if it's the first action of your activation and you're halfway up the wall, you can just make another action to climb up the other half and then get there. Or down, right? And again, if it fails that second climb check, it's still going to fall. So if you're climbing up a wall and you move up orange, and then you fail the second climb to get to the top, then you're going to fall down orange. If it doesn't have another action this activation, the rules state that you should record where the model is, remove it from the table, which personally I would probably leave it on the table and find some way to designate that it's climbing. And this is more so that I don't forget that the model's climbing, you don't forget that the model's climbing, and then we both understand that that model is climbing, and then I don't forget about it on my next turn and go, oh, poop. I've just left this model off the table. Now I need to go back and add an activation token and have it climb, or just lose its activation. So for me, what I would probably do is just find a way to annotate their climbing, whether you get little climb tokens or whatever works for you. I am not a big fan of taking models off the table unless they need to come off the table, simply because I've got a lizard brain and I don't want to forget. I've got that like object permanence. It goes away and now it's just out of sight, out of mind. But if you don't make it, and like if you don't make it all the way up and your whole activation ends, you remove it from the table And then when it activates again, you just simply continue its climb as normal. But a climbing model, while it's in a climb, may not attack or use expertise, and it still may be targeted and shot by ranged attacks, and then it may be engaged if the base of the climbing model would be within orange of the attacking model's base. So effectively, what that's going to mean is, and this is to me the easiest way, is like if your movement's orange, if you only made one climb check, you're probably still going to be able to get charged and fought. I know technically you move like front to back, like you leapfrog it, but it's one of those where kind of vague. I assume the intent is basically if your movement of climb is orange and you only make one climb check, you're still able to get bonked. And that makes sense to me. Jumping down is always an option instead of climbing. So if you're on the descent, you can opt to jump down instead of climb. Jumping takes a single action and the model automatically completes the jump. The model automatically takes its fall damage, but the fall damage counts as being one range shorter. So there is a benefit to jumping as opposed to climbing. One, it's just a single, I do this. You don't have to make repeated checks and try to get down. Two, you do reduce the fall damage. So if it's orange, if you're jumping from orange, you're going to take no fall damage. Now we're going to talk about fall damage since we're already on that subject. When a model fails a climb or jumps down from a height, it suffers fall damage. And the first range is orange, and orange is one black die. So if you fall orange, you roll one black die, and that's your fall damage. And then you add 2 more black dice to the pool for each range it increases. So to go from orange to yellow adds 2, so you'd roll 3 black dice. If you go to blue, for example, you're actually going to roll 9 dice, and then black is 11 dice. When rolling damage dice for falling, each little POW symbol, right, we know what it looks like. It's the little damage symbol on the black die. It adds 1 to the damage, the same as it would for a normal attack. But then each Nuka-Cola bottle reduces the falling model's armor by 1. So it kind of acts as an armor break. It does ignore all other symbols, so it doesn't matter what else gets rolled. You're just looking for the POW damage symbol, and you're looking for Nuka-Cola bottles, and that's it. You would get your normal armor roll for physical damage against it, provided the Nuka-Cola rolls didn't just negate it. And you would get strong armor against it as well, is my assumption, because the way strong armor is worded is anytime you take damage, you just reduce it by 1. Models in power armor ignore all fall damage. That's important to note. And then ranges greater than black for falling result in the model dying. Obviously not for power armor because it ignores all fall damage. I assume, again, that's the intent. It doesn't explicitly call it out, and it doesn't say that black or greater than black does damage. It just says remove the model from the table. But given that the power armor ignores fall damage, I assume the intent is that even if it's greater than black, the power armor's not dying. If I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments. That's the way I interpreted it. It could be simply that like you're just falling too far and it doesn't matter and you create a crater and you can't withstand that fall damage. Again, I'm making assumptions. I haven't found anything in any kind of FAQs on it yet, and my assumption is just like, hey, if it's greater than black, the power armor can still make that jump, but everything else just dies. And then if you see a ladder with a red line through it, that just means the model can't climb. So again, if we go back to the super mutant behemoths, they do unimpeded, so they ignore difficult terrain, but then they also can't climb. So they can move over a lot of things without taking a movement penalty, but they can't climb anything. And then Gutsies also have that, Handies also have that, iBots also have that. And again, there's nothing stating that they all float. It's one of those, I'm probably nitpicking because, again, we all know it. We all play the video games. We all know how these things work. But from a outsider's perspective, I might not know that if I've never played the video games, and then the tabletop game is my first interaction. I might just be like, well, they don't really float, like etc. So it's just one of those, like, if it's not in the rules somewhere, it probably should be. If it is, let me know in the comments where it's at so I can find it, so I can post it. I just haven't come across it yet. The last thing I want to talk about with regard to terrain is kind of a, I don't want to say it's a tacked on rule, but it's just kind of shoehorned into the terrain rules. And that's the edge of the world. Some things to keep in mind, it's a hard edge. So if something were to force a model off the table, it'll just stop at the edge. And then forcing a model off of the edge means the model must stop, right? Like that's what I just said. But then that model takes one regular damage with no armor roll to prevent it. And again, the way the armor rules in the book read, it indicates that strong armor would still reduce it. Again, if you have seen something that suggests otherwise, please let me know in the comments. I am all for making sure we all understand how this game works, because that's why I wanted to do these videos, so that we could discuss and spread knowledge on how to play. I'm not like a huge rules lawyer. I'm not going to sit here and argue with people at the table about what it's supposed to be and what it's not supposed to be. I'd much rather we just all collaborate and get on the same page, and then we don't have to worry about having rules lawyers. If everybody understands how the games work, it takes a lot of the nitpicking out of it anyway. Before I tell you guys what I'm doing next, the one thing I did want to talk about is, again, the terrain, right? So you have, you could do low walls. For example, a lot of our games we're using the Orc Kill Team terrain. First of all, it looks very Raiderish, very Fallout-ish, and it fits the aesthetic very well, especially if it's painted right. So it works for that. But one of the things that comes with is like scrap piles, and then like the little low junk walls. What we've been doing is the junk walls are just difficult terrain, right? And it just makes life easier because there's like windows and doors and low parts and high parts. So the whole thing just counts as difficult terrain. And then we just count the height of that wall equal to the height of its middle point, right? Because like there's windows, there's doors, you could kind of like get through a window or door, it doesn't matter. Rather than sit there and go, well, the edge of this wall is this and the edge of the wall is that. Well, blah, 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 blah. It's just, hey, man, this wall is actually orange in height, so it's half an orange tall. So it's difficult terrain for small models, and that's it. That's what we've been doing. And so it's just something I wanted to share with everybody is that's a great way to me to approach it is like, hey, these all have this no matter what, and this all has that no matter what. And that's just so everybody, again, is on the same page. As a player, I have gone places for, again, for those of you that have been following me for a while, I was real big into 40K for a while, especially in 8th and 9th, right? And so I would go travel to tournaments and events, and especially in 8th, but even in 9th to some degree, people would be like, well, we don't like this rule, so we don't use it locally. And now we don't even know how to use it. So when you come to our events, it's not going to be in effect. And nobody knows this but our locals. So it's one of those where it's kind of weird. And if that's what you want to do with your friends, I'm all for it, man. Like, you guys are playing at your house, you're doing your thing. I'm not going to tell you what to do in your own home. But if you're running a public event, like, this is the perspective I'm coming from, and this is why I want to make sure we're all on the same page, and that's why I make these videos, is not to be like, this is the only way you should play, but because as a person who organizes campaigns, who organizes tournaments, I want to make sure my play group understands the expectations of like, hey guys, this is the rules we're going to use, and we're only going to change things if they really are vague or kind of just like busted, which we're going to talk about in just another second. Like I'm only going to FAQ or change things if it's a real bad, feels bad for either or both players. And again, we're going to talk about that in just a second. In the next episodes that I have coming up, I'm going to take a deep dive look at power armor and how it interacts with everything else in the game. We're going to talk about it with regard to like strong armor, degradation, stacking with clothing, etc. We're going to talk about all these things. And then the next episode after that, we're going to talk about scatter. We're going to talk about blast. And one of the things that we've came up across, and that's what I wanted to discuss real quick, and that's, again, maybe I'm missing something, but a courser or a nightkin or anything with a stealth boy has a special rule that basically says if you want to interact with it, and I'm paraphrasing, but it basically says if you want to interact with it, you take a -4 penalty, and you are on a perception check to see if you can even see it. But then the follow up to that is that the shooting rules state you don't have to target a model. It literally says a model or a point on the board, etc. So what's ended up happening is, oh, well, you have a stealth boy. Well, I'm just going to shoot the ground next to your model with a stealth boy. And again, uh, I understand the perspective of like, hey, man, the intent is probably not that, and I'm not going to argue that. The issue is also that, there's just some weird interactions there. So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. Again, if that's something that you've come across, or that they've FAQ'd this is how this works, let me know and cite the source. Because again, I'm just one person and I'm still digging through everything. So anything that you can do that would make my job easier, so that I can kind of like process it and then regurgitate it back to all of you, that's just going to make my videos better for you, and then that's going to make everything better for everybody. Because I have had nothing but a great time with this game, and my goal is to grow a local community and foster a local community the same way I had done for the previous 5 years with 40K. So I appreciate all the help that the community at large has given me, and a big thanks to Chris Birch, one of the owners at Modifius, for letting me post in the Facebook group just to share my videos. Big thanks to Modifius for allowing me to do that. They didn't have to. They could have just been like, nah, dog. So again, big thanks to them. And then probably in the next couple weeks, we're going to do the settlement supplement. We're going to start digging through that, and probably some of the RPG rules, because I'm looking to incorporate the RPG rules to do a ongoing campaign. So we'll talk about that too. Sorry, I'm a little bit wordy, but that's going to do it.